Yo, what's up, legends? This is Chronos, back at it with part 6 of What If Deku Had Energy Absorption Quirk. Things are about to get intense, and trust me, you don't want to miss this chapter. Big shout out to Big Teddy G3498 for the incredible collab. We've come a long way thanks to you. And of course, my amazing legends, your support is everything. So let's keep this energy going. Alright, let's dive right in and see where this journey takes Deku next. Chapter 36, Talk with Nezu. The next morning, Izuku woke up and headed to the hospital where Eri was staying to visit her as he had promised. He went alone with a bag filled with empty notebooks and a few crayons for her to pass the time with. He wasn't sure what else he could bring her while she stayed at the hospital, but he hoped that would bring a smile to her face. He arrived and signed in as a visitor. The receptionist recognized him from the day before and waved him in with a warm smile. The hospital was one of the many locations with heightened security due to its patients. He noticed there were two small-time heroes at each end of the floor when he got off the elevator on Eri's floor. He was pleased to see Aizawa had taken his words to heart. He knocked on the door to her room and slid it open to see her seated in the bed. He smiled brilliantly at her in greeting, and her eyes shone at seeing him again. "Izuku, you came back." "Of course I did. I promised, didn't I?" He sat down next to her bed and pulled his bag off his shoulder. "Here, I got these for you. I guessed it might be boring to stay in here all the time." Eri took the notebooks and crayons in hand. "For me?" She looked up. "Yep, you can keep that and draw or write whatever you want," he said with a smile. She ran her hand over her new notebooks and opened one. "Thank you," she said softly. Izuku just smiled and nodded. He went on to ask her about her day so far and how she has been doing. She told him it was all right for the most part with the nice nurses, but scary in a new place with strangers. He nodded along and chatted with her for the rest of the time together. He drew with her in the notebooks and told her about his plans to be a hero. She listened to every word, and when Izuku saw she didn't understand something, he explained it. He could see she wasn't used to asking questions or maybe allowed to ask them, so he explained when he could for her. He stopped when he got a call and he checked to see who it was. He furrowed his brows at the unknown number and answered without saying anything. The voice on the other end was recognizable. "Hello, this is Principal Nezu calling." A higher-pitched voice came out of the speaker. Izuku curled his lips slightly and answered. "Yes," he said curtly. "I want to have a meeting with you as soon as possible to talk about your request to Fat Gum." His jovial tone didn't drop. "Be there in 2 hours." "Wonderful. See you then." Izuku scowled at the phone in his hands and how the chimera had his phone number, but he wiped the look off his face and turned to Eri. "I've got to go very soon, but I will be back another day. All right?" Eri looked apprehensive for a moment, but then nodded. She looked down at the notebook she was drawing in. Pained Izuku to see her like that. "How would you like it if I brought some of my friends with me next time?" She looked up at him. "Friends?" He smiled warmly at her and pulled out his phone to show her some pictures. He told them their names in the group photo taken in the woods months back. "They are my closest friends," he said smiling. "Are they nice? Like you? I think they're even nicer than me. How about it?" "Okay," she said softly. He patted her head with a smile and headed out to meet with the principal of UA. He thought about the chimera and what he might have planned. The trip back to UA was uneventful. It was nearing midday as he walked through the barrier of the school and into the main building. He walked up to the door with his senses active. It was slightly hard to see on the other side of the door. His guess was the room was insulated, but switching from thermal sense to stamina showed two entities inside. One entity's stamina was low and the other was at the standard of everyone else. He knocked on the door and it opened to show Aizawa and Nezu waiting for him. "Midoriya, so nice of you to join us. Please sit." Nezu motioned him to a couch across from Aizawa.
There.
He sat down and kept his senses trained on Aizawa after scanning the room with all of the different energies he had. He declined the offer of tea by shaking his head. "What is it you wanted to discuss?" "Straight to business." "Very well." Nezu finished pouring his tea and took a sip. "Why is it you want Eri to be brought to UA?" "So I can help her control her quirk, and she has become emotionally attached to me. Also, I see it to be the best option for her to be safe near me," Izuku said concisely. "Safe near you?" "Not UA," Aizawa asked. How many attacks has Yue warded off? Izuku shot the hero a look. Watch it. Aizawa warned and was about to activate his quirk, but Izuku was shrouded in the darkest black. His quirk had no effect and Izuku turned to Nezu, disregarding Aizawa. Nezu watched carefully the interaction between the two and turned to Izuku, whose body was hidden by a coating of void. And you would be willing to watch over young Eri? Why? Nezu lost his advantage in reading people with the student's quirk activated. Izuku was quiet for a moment as he stared at the chimera. Because I want to help her. Simple as that. And it was the truth. Izuku wanted to help Eri have a normal life away from the abuse and torture she had to endure. Nezu hummed in thought and sat back in his chair. Very well, I will take this into consideration. He paused and asked, Is there anything else you would like to talk about? It was a shot in the dark to gain the boy's trust. Izuku stopped from getting up and stared at Nezu through his shroud of the void. He watched him even more closely with his quirk, sensing his thermal energy rise with his emotions. His electric energy was quite different from everyone else due to Nezu's quirk, high specs. Izuku could see the equivalent emotion to anxiousness as to humans on Nezu. How is it that Mirio Togata has another quirk? Nezu's temperature rose inside his body as he finished the last word. Aizawa furrowed his brow in confusion and looked between the blotch of the void and his boss, who was eerily still. He didn't speak and was in favor of listening carefully. Nezu's mind was alive with hundreds of thoughts going through his head at what the boy had just asked. It was a possible mistake to ask for the beginning of the olive branch, but if Nezu could have Izuku Midoriya as an ally to fight all for one once again. Before Nezu could open his mouth again to break the silence, Izuku's hand rose to stop anything. If that is too difficult to answer, let me ask this instead. Is he part of All for One? The villain All Might fought in the Kamino Ward to save Katsuki. Izuku sensed the temperature in Nezu's body dim slightly on his extremities, which gave Izuku enough of an answer. He is a good ally to fight against him should the need arise, Nezu said neutrally. I've researched the boogeyman of the first Quirk era. It was incredibly fascinating to read about a man with the ability to take away people's curses and give them to others to gain their loyalty. It was ingenious to do so while gaining his power. He kept anything that he fancied while giving out the dregs to his followers. Izuku rambled on in the true interest of the villain. What is your point, Midoriya? Aizawa cut in. Izuku's mouth clamped shut and he glared at Aizawa with a little distaste for interrupting his thought process. My point is Mirio not a follower of All for One? Mirio said himself that his quirk evolved recently, and Izuku could confirm that by watching his second-year sports festival and then his third year where he showed off his new strength and speed. Izuku sensed Nezu relax slightly in his chair with his electrical energy dying down in the chimera's mind. I can assure you that Mirio isn't a follower of All for One, although I must commend your research. Nezu tried to steer the conversation away from the villain. Izuku furrowed his brow as he thought about the subject. He knows Nezu isn't an idiot who would risk having a follower of All for One in his school. Much less if the person in question was powerful to the degree Mirio is. But All for One would have had a tight leash on anyone that powerful, so why doesn't he? Why wouldn't All for One be able to control Mirio after giving him the quirk? He didn't get the quirk from All for One, Izuku said softly to himself. His quirk trained on Nezu confirmed that theory as his mind spun up again. Before Nezu could get a word in, he heard Midoriya talk to himself. Then who? Nezu's mind began to run faster as the boy began to piece together a puzzle. Izuku stood up in need of having something to write down. He needed to research his theory of Mirio getting a quirk from someone. He pulled his phone out to begin his research on who it might be, but it was snatched away from his grasp by Aizawa, who was signaled by Nezu to stop him. You need some sleep? Izuku flicked his wrist, and the remaining stamina in his teacher's body drained away. He slumped over on the couch, dead to the world, as he walked by and took his phone back to begin his new objective. Nezu was alarmed at seeing his staff member fall over without a sound or a touch from anyone. Why do you want to know who gave Mirio his quirk? Izuku didn't turn as he typed away at his phone to make notes. Because you sparked my curiosity, and it would be a good idea to know where the next symbol of peace got his second quirk. His pace slowed and came to a stop as he said the last phrase. His brow furrowed under his shroud, and he pinched his lip in thought. Mirio interned only under Sir Night-Eye, a man who saw All Might as a deity. His mind began to make connections, but it was all conjecture at the moment. He began to move again to the door, but it was locked when he tried to open it. The door is locked. It would be better if you unlocked it before I did. Half of his mind is on the world around him and the other half on thinking about Mirio's quirk. What will you do once you find out? What is your end goal? With the information, most likely nothing. But I like to know everything I can about everyone near me, and most especially the most powerful people, so if they step out of line. Well, you saw how that ended with Katsuki, so much for that, Izuku said with his lip curdling at the thought of the blonde. As for my end goal, he paused and thought about his various plans. I have a few. Now the door. The door clicked and Izuku strolled out and headed to his room to write down his thoughts. Not once did he remember to turn off his shroud. Nezu rubbed his snout in frustration after Midoriya had left. Nezu had a few ideas to gain his trust, but after speaking to him, he knew none of them would work. His thoughts on having him become a ward of the school would only lead to misfortune on their part should they misstep. Nezu understood the distrust of the boy. He experienced the same problem when he escaped the lab. Nezu had watched Izuku Midoriya carefully since the beginning of the year when he appeared to have a quirk even when his file had said he was quirkless. It is quite ironic that they spoke but all for one's followers when they were thinking he was one himself at the beginning of the school year. Now he found a close circle of friends with whom he could lower his guard while elevating their power with his quirk theory. He had seen the bottom two shoot up from 19th and 20th rank in the classroom to 16th and 17th, with the others in his circle rising as well. That's not to mention their power with their quirks. Nezu sighed and pulled out a cigarette to smoke as he watched one of the few people able to stop Midoriya asleep on his couch. It was obvious to him that he gained more energies from how easily he dealt with Eraserhead. Nezu pulled out a ball he played with while thinking and threw it at Aizawa's head to wake him up, but it bounced off without him stirring. He could only guess what Midoriya did to Eraserhead. Chapter 37, Research. Izuku walked back to the dorms with his mind in the clouds. He didn't pay any mind to anyone who gave him odd looks due to his void shroud that he forgot to turn off. He walked into the dorms and everyone went quiet at seeing a humanoid shape made of void. For Izuku's part, he didn't even notice as his thoughts were still on Mirio and where he got his quirk from. Nezu all but confirmed it during their conversation not long ago. He was brought out of his thoughts by someone stepping in front of his path to his room. He saw it was Ida and he was in a combat stance. Izuku's lip curled slightly at the obnoxious boy. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" Ida asked. "What?" Izuku asked with a scowl at the boy. He looked down at himself and saw the void covering. "Oh," he dispelled it. "Forgot about that." He looked around to see the classmates in the common room relax their tense postures at seeing a stranger walk into the dorms. He waved as an apology for scaring them and moved to walk past Ida. He stopped Izuku again. "What kind of sick joke was that?" Ida asked with distaste. "Simple mistake," Izuku muttered absent-mindedly and walked past him with his mind going back to Mirio. He felt like there was a connection between Mirio and All Might through Sir Night-Eye. But his thoughts were brought back to Ida as he stopped him again. He didn't hear what he said, but it was something along the lines of his negligence of quirk use. He scowled again and used his quirk properly to silence the surrounding area around him and walked past Ida, ignoring his waving arms. Izuku opened his room and sat down at his desk where his laptop was, and he grabbed an empty notebook to begin his research. First, he went to watch Mirio's past sports festival from every year to truly get an understanding of his quirk. He already had an outline of Mirio's quirk and how he developed it, but now he was looking at his history and who he associated with. Tamaki is one of his oldest friends from what Izuku gleaned with their time together under Fat Gum, with Nijire joining the two at UA. All of them became close friends due to their supposedly weak quirks in their first year, but after 2 more years, they grew to become the Big Three. Mirio's internship began with Sir Night-Eye in his first year, and the hero mentored Mirio ever since. But the question is, why would Sir invite Mirio as an intern if Sir's way of doing things was meticulously and with long planning while Mirio was more headstrong? Granted, Mirio has learned more of Sir's way of doing things, but he isn't an investigator like Sir is. Izuku stopped writing and leaned back in his chair with a sigh. He was startled when he felt a kiss on his cheek and turned around to see Toru and the rest of his friends in his room. His sound absorption stopped and he looked at them with surprise. Mina and Toru were on Izuku's bed with Toru seated against the headboard while Mina was lying face down reading a manga. Denki and Hanta had brought beanbag chairs and were reading comic books or had manga in hand. They looked around when the sound worked again. "What are you guys doing in here?" Izuku asked, still startled from seeing them where he thought he was alone. "You looked kinda mad back there and we came up here to check on you, but you were lost in the sauce. So we let you be and hung out here," Hanta said first. "Yeah. Mina over here brought the manga, but it's all trashy rom-coms," Denki complained. "If you don't like it, then give it back." Denki batted her hand away and rolled away to keep reading. "I'm not done yet." "So, what's got you riled up?" Toru asked her boyfriend. Izuku smiled at all of them and waved their concerns away. "Just doing some profiling like Mina likes to call it. There's a connection between Mirio and All Might, but I don't see it." Mina hummed in thought and looked over Izuku's shoulder at Mirio's face from the third-year sports festival. "Other than he looks kinda like him, I've got no clue." Mina shrugged and grabbed one of his pillows to continue her reading. "Why are you so curious, Izuku?" "Shuku?" Toru asked him, but he was staring at Mirio's photo. Oh, he's in the sauce again. Gotta give him another kiss to bring him out." Hanta teased Toru. Izuku scooted forward again and began to type away in his laptop. Toru giggled at his serious face and let him work on whatever he was working on. She sat on his bed and then snatched one of Izuku's pillows from Mina. She leaned back on it to continue her reading. The longer Izuku stared at Mirio's face, the more he could see the similarity between him and All Might. The blonde hair, bright smile, high spirits, and his catchphrase. It all was just like a younger version of All Might. Izuku searched back to when Sir and All Might went their separate ways, and it was over 5 years ago, the same time as All Might took a break for the first time in years, and his appearance began to diminish. Sir wanted a copy of All Might because he saw that the symbol of peace's time was coming to an end. Izuku stopped writing and furrowed his brow. Unknowingly, he also stopped muttering, which caused his friend to look at him. "What is All Might's quirk?" Izuku already knew everything he wanted to know about the man, and he was becoming very aware of the similar powers between Mirio's evolution and All Might's quirk. "You all right there?" Denki asked worriedly. "I'll be back," Izuku said to them and leapt out the balcony to blast off to the school library. He heard shouts of alarm about his actions from his friends, but he paid them no mind. He quickly arrived at the library of UA and he began by going to the terminal to search what he was looking for. He typed in the search bar the year All Might graduated and quickly went to find the yearbook. He pulled it out. It was worn down by the many students doing something similar to what he was doing. He sat down with the book and flipped it open to find Yagi Tashinori's smiling face with his hero's name right under it. For most hero students, they got a page dedicated to them about where they came from and what their inspiration were to become a hero. He knew this from one day looking around the library when he was bored. Izuku found where Yagi Tashinori came from and wrote it on a notepad he brought. He was about to close the yearbook when he stopped and reread a line from All Might's inspirations. "My biggest inspiration is and always will be Ms. Maverick. I will always strive to be what she showed me I could be." Izuku stared at that name and memorized it before writing it down as well. His gut feeling was that there was more to All Might's quirk, and it was the answer to where Mirio got his second quirk. He put the yearbook away and headed back to his room. He startled Denki when he came in from the balcony, which caused him to crush the bag of chips he was eating. "And where did you go?" Toru had her hands on her hips and stared down Izuku. For his part, Izuku froze and looked around the room. Mina was hiding a smirk while Denki was picking up chips from the ground and eating them quickly. Hanta had his eyebrow raised with a smirk at the two. "To the library? Well, you didn't have to give me a heart attack by jumping off the balcony." Toru pouted with her arms crossed. She turned her face away from him. I'm sorry. I won't do that again," Izuku said apologetically. Toru peeked at him and nodded with satisfaction. "Good. I don't want to see you jumping off high places again." She went over to hug him after admonishing him. "Oh, like an old married couple. How adorable." Mina cooed with both hands clasped together in front of her. Izuku blushed at the mention of marriage with Toru, and the rising heat on her face gave Izuku the sense she was in the same boat. They separated and got back to what they were doing before, with Izuku at his computer and Toru snuggling under his bed covers. The absorber rubbed his face to get his mind back on track from Mina's remark. First, he wanted to search for the school Yagi Tashinori graduated from before UA. He had the school district and he went from there. It took him a couple of hours to find where Yagi Tashinori went to school before UA, since they all have been closed down or renamed for one reason or another. His way of finding it was to search the digital yearbook of each school of the year he should have graduated from. There were many schools in the district, but his dedication bared fruit when he found a scrawny young man's photo with the matching name. The same blue eyes and golden blonde hair had a plain smile in the yearbook photos. The school he went to closed down for unknown reasons. Izuku began to scour the internet for any additional information that contained Yagi Tashinori. Before he could continue, he heard a tapping noise and Izuku looked up to see Mina, Denki, and Hanta waving at him from his doorway. He looked confused and looked over to where Mina was pointing with a beaming smile. Toru was under his bed sheets asleep and it was dark out the window. Izuku kept quiet and waved to his friends. When they left, Izuku glanced over at Toru, who was drooling on his pillow, with a smile. He smiled warmly at her and then got back to work to find the truth about All Might's quirk. The rest of the gang closed the door quietly and tiptoed downstairs. It was nearing 10 at night when they decided to leave Toru and Izuku. "What do you think got Izuku going on his research?" Denki asked when they were one floor down. "Not sure, but he looked determined, that's for sure," Mina said. "Did you see what he was looking at?" Denki asked. The three were making their way to the kitchen for a late-night snack before bed. "All Might and that Mirio guy," Hanta spoke quietly. "He was searching for All Might's quirk. I heard him faintly before he leapt off the balcony." They were quiet for a moment as they snatched things to eat before bed. "Should we be worried?" Mina asked. "We'll keep an eye on him." Hanta nodded. Toru woke up to a familiar bed and her hair sticking everywhere. She groaned softly before rolling over to hug Izuku, but she found nothing. Confused, she felt around until she raised her head with one eye open slightly to look around. She found Izuku immediately right where she last saw him, at his desk. He had bags under his eyes from the lack of sleep, and he was writing furiously while looking up at his computer screen frequently. He was quietly mumbling to himself to prevent waking her up. "Suku, have you been there the whole night?" She mumbled while rubbing her eyes clear of sleep. He was startled from his work and looked over to Toru, staring at him with disapproval. "It's fine." The stamina energy helped to keep the sleep away. "How did you sleep?" he asked with a smile. Toru pursed her lips at his behavior and skipping sleep. "Good, but it could have been better," she pouted. Izuku ducked his head. "Sorry, I lost track of time," he said apologetically. "Anyways, it's fine. It's the weekend." He tried to appease her. "Still, you shouldn't cut out sleep entirely like that." I know. I just..." He waved his hand at the open notebooks that were filled with new notes. "Did you eat at least?" She didn't get an answer and she intensified her glare. "Izuku!" she almost shouted. "I forgot." Toru got up from his bed. She arranged her hair so it wouldn't bother her, and straightened her wrinkled clothes before grabbing Izuku by the arm and dragging him to the door. "After breakfast, you will sleep." "Wait, Toru. Give me a chance to put my notes away at least," Izuku pleaded. She squinted her eyes at him and crossed her arms. He quickly grabbed everything on his desk and put it inside a complex-looking box that opened after some button pushes. He pushed the heavy box back into his closet and closed it. Izuku turned to see Toru with an eyebrow raised at his actions, and he waved her concerns away. He was then dragged downstairs to the kitchen where a few of his classmates were already seated and eating. Toru sat Izuku down and began to grab ingredients to cook a breakfast. When Izuku tried to get up to help, he was glared at until he sat back down. He sullenly sat as Toru cooked him breakfast. His mind wandered to what he had found out last night. Yagi Tashinori was either a late bloomer like Izuku was, or he got his quirk just like Mirio did. It was a newspaper that was uploaded, and Izuku had found it was before Yagi's time at UA. The paper did have much but one small article on a young man who fought off a few thugs with a pipe and then was arrested for vigilantism. He was later released when it came out he was quirkless and didn't break any laws. The name was Yagi Tashinori. He had discovered that in between his third year of middle school and first year of UA, he got his quirk. Just like Izuku, but he wasn't so sure that he was a late bloomer like he was. He let that matter drop from his research when he couldn't find any more information on Yagi Tashinori. The next topic was interest, Ms. Maverick. She was a mid-tier hero before Yagi graduated from UA. When he looked her up, she had a basic flight quirk when she started, but at the end of her career, she was stronger and faster than she was reported to be before. She died to an unknown villain soon after Yagi graduated from UA, where he disappeared and made his debut in the USA a few years later. Ms. Maverick's power increases drastically at some point in her hero career. It was too similar to the other two to be a coincidence, especially when they were all connected. The information began to get harder to find as he went farther back to when Maverick got her power up. So instead, he looked up heroes who died with the added parameters that their quirk evolved before they died. He was brought out of his thoughts when Tour set a plate of eggs and sausage with toast before him. She beamed proudly at her work, and Izuku gave her a thankful smile before eating her well-done food. She sat down next to him and ate her plate of food with him. They ate in relative silence and enjoyed having one another close by. When he finished his food, he let out a long yawn that Toru had caught. She quickly washed the dishes and marched him up to his room to lie down for a few hours. He tried to protest that he wasn't that tired, but once he had laid down he was drifting off to sleep. Toru sat next to him in bed and brushed his messy hair back, and he slipped away. She giggled and got comfortable before grabbing the book she dropped the night before to continue her reading next to a softly snoring Izuku. Chapter 38. Theories. After his mandatory nap by Toru, Izuku woke up late in the evening to an empty room. He looked around groggily to see his room was organized somewhat, and some of his clothes were neatly folded where they were strewn about in his room. He blushed at the idea of Toru going around in his room and cleaning up after himself. He stumbled out of bed and grabbed a bottle of water that was on his nightstand that wasn't there when he went to sleep. He was even more grateful for his loving girlfriend. He stretched and then pulled out the notes he was working on and continued his research on Ms. Maverick and when she evolved her quirk just like Mirio did. His running theory is that somehow Mirio received a quirk and his only lead from there was All Might. It became almost impossible since the generation before Ms. Maverick was more loose about keeping records, but he was able to find one hero who matched what he was looking for. A regular hero with a simple enough quirk that evolved and granted him enhanced speed and strength. And then he mysteriously died to an unknown villain, which to be fair was more common than he thought. The hero was only known as N. From there, he lost any kind of trail from people evolving their quirks and then dying to an unknown villain. Izuku sat back in his chair and rubbed his messy hair with a sigh. He looked at his notes and read them over to see if he could gain anything from them. Mirio's quirk evolved after All Might came to teach at UA under the guise of retirement. Yagi was previously quirkless, and between his last year of middle school and UA, he got a quirk. Izuku paused and truly thought about the last statement. All Might, Yagi Tashinori, told him to give up being a hero because he was supposedly quirkless, and here he was getting a quirk gifted to him after knowing exactly what Izuku went through. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to continue on his path. He could come back to the hypocrisy of All Might later. Ms. Maverick had her quirk evolved, and before her, and story was the same before they both died to an unknown villain. The correlation between all of them was the enhanced strength and speed that shouldn't have been there to begin with. Yagi played it off as his quirk, but he was born quirkless. Then Mirio received this enhanced strength and speed from All Might after he came to UA. And he guessed that Sir Night Eye groomed him to become the second coming of the symbol of peace from their disturbing similarities. Izuku stopped and thought about what he had learned and what he could do with the information. At the moment, nothing, but now he knows that Mirio's other quirk was passed on like a relay racer and he could pass the quirk to another person. The more he thought about it, the more it was believable with the existence of the quirk boogeyman from the dawn of quirks. If there was someone who could take and give quirks, then why couldn't there be a quirk that has been passed around for who knows how long? There could even be a connection between the boogeyman and the quirk somehow. Maybe there could even be other quirks with the same ability to be passed along or transferred. His phone rang and he was thrown out of his thoughts. Looking at the caller ID, it showed Fat Gum. He answered it without any thought. Midoriya, how have you been? I've been hearing you've been checking up on the little one. Fat Gum's energetic voice came through the speaker. I'm good, and yes, I visited Eri the day before and was thinking of going again soon. What did you call for? What? A mentor can't check up on his student?
No, jest.
I am calling to tell you that both Sunniators and your work studies will be postponed because of the intensity of the Shai Hasaikai raid. And not just yours, but just about everyone's, to make it fair, as they told me. We weren't expecting the raid to be this bad and the possible outcome that could have resulted if something was just a bit off. Fat Gum explained. Izuku furrowed his brows. Why would they postpone it? Hero work is unpredictable, and it's our job to control that unpredictably to make sure people are safe. Sure, the raid was a lot for first years, I'm guessing, but that doesn't mean we should take a break. Fat Gum sighed. I agree, but it's out of my hands now. I see. Thank you for having me for the short time we worked together. I enjoyed it. The smile could be heard as he spoke. Of course. I would be happy to have you back anytime. They said their farewells and hung up. Izuku leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. He did enjoy working with Fat Gum and Tamaki to a lesser extent. The hero was what heroes should be and not what more and more heroes are becoming. Izuku sees too many heroes who work for fame and glory in the hero business rather than working on helping people as they should be. That thought reminded him of Stain and what his ideals were before he was taken away. Izuku shook his head from the darkening thoughts and got up to eat something. Heading downstairs, he was met by some of the class in the common room playing games or relaxing on the sofas. He saw Toru and Mina chatting animatedly with Uraraka and Jairu while the guys from his gang were playing on a console hooked up to the TV. Toru saw him and waved at him with a smile. Mina caught the action and teased Toru as the invisible girl pushed Mina's face away as retribution. Izuku smiled back and waved while heading to the kitchen. He made a simple meal of a few sandwiches and sat down to watch from the kitchen as the guys made a tournament within the game. When he finished, he joined them on the couches and continued to watch. Denki tried to rope him into playing, but he declined. He continued to egg him on until he gave up under peer pressure and gave it a try just to end up losing immediately. Hanta sent Denki a dirty glare as he was the one to trounce Izuku without giving him a chance. The rest of the night continued that way until it was time for sleep before the day of class the next day. The class was back in the concrete gym for more super move training. Izuku was sitting down and experimenting with combining energies and seeing their results. He already had his 3 main super moves, and adding more to his arsenal would be for the best. He had an idea for a new energy he could obtain, but he was restraining himself from sprinting right at the person in question. For now, he merged a few energies to see the results, and most of them were less than satisfying. Thermal, electric, kinetic, light, sound, nuclear, stamina, shield, rewind, and bomb were his current options, but more was always good. Izuku got up to find the person in question, but was stalled by Yagi approaching him with a smile. Young Midoriya, how goes your training? Yagi asked. The previous #1 hero was hopeful to see the bridge repaired between the two, but Izuku's next words dashed that hope brutally. Just fine, Yagi, Izuku said coldly. Is everything all right, my boy? Yagi asked, confused. Izuku turned back to the emaciated man and observed him for a moment. Why did you tell me what you did on the rooftop that day? He asked neutrally. Yagi sighed and rubbed his neck as he looked away. I said what I thought was best. Did Ms. Maverick tell you the same? Izuku asked with his head tilted. His eyes bore into Yagi as he froze in his motion. Izuku put his hands behind his back and continued to watch Yagi very carefully to see if his research was right. Yagi felt cold as he processed the words, and then looked up sharply at the young man who was watching him with a blank expression behind his half-mask. What do you mean by that? Izuku turned his head to continue watching Yagi as he began to pace around the retired hero. Did Ms. Maverick tell you to be realistic in your dreams to become a hero? Or was she more encouraging to a quirkless teen who wishes for a break from the life that continues to beat him down? Yagi continued to watch the teen with the pit in his stomach, continuing to grow with each word. What chilled Yagi Tashinori the most was Izuku's posture and the way he walked. Much too similar to the villain he put down twice. "What are you talking about?" Yagi acted confused. Izuku could see the sweat beginning to bead around Yagi's forehead and pressed on. "I like to research everything and anything that catches my eye. It's been a hobby ever since I was a child. Left to my own devices after being told I was useless, I watched people and documented many things. From behavior to fighting styles to quirks." His eyes snapped onto Yagi's at the last word with intensity. "I love quirks. They are fascinating, and I was entranced by the thing I didn't have for most of my life. I like to pick them apart and find every detail I can. I can say if I had never had a path in the hero business, then I would most likely be a quirk analyst." "Why didn't you then?" Yagi desperately tried to change the conversation. Izuku ignored his question and continued his pacing around the retired hero like a dog circling an injured rodent. "So when I see an interesting quirk, then I lock into it and break it apart and see how they could work and how they could be used. When I saw Mirio Togata's quirk, boy was I fascinated by it. To become intangible with the minor side effect that he couldn't see, breathe, or hear while submerged was incredible and had so many applications if used right. But when I saw Mirio in person for the first time and fought him, something just wasn't right. His quirk evolved," Izuku hummed. "When I tell you I researched quirks, that means I research every little bit of them. For example, my quirk is an extreme evolution of my parents with some mutation added to it. Inko could pull objects to her, and Hisashi, my father, could breathe fire. You could see how those two could make something like my quirk." "But Mirio," Izuku shook his head. "When quirks evolve, they are linear. That means that they will become more powerful in the same direction that their quirk is already on. For example, Kirishima recently had a minor evolution. His skin hardened even further at the cost of his stamina. If Toru evolved, then she could extend her quirk to others possibly. But gaining incredible strength and speed to intangibility? That doesn't add up. Just like how a quirkless teen could gain a quirk in their 3rd year of middle school. Granted, that's more possible, look at me after all. But a person with a flight quirk gaining strength and speed? Or someone with a smoke screen quirk doing the same?" Izuku stopped and faced Yagi, who was pale as a ghost while looking extremely serious. "Why go through all the trouble?" Yagi asked steadily. Izuku didn't answer right away. "Honestly," he shrugged. "Curiosity, mostly. But I also like to know who is near me and what their capabilities are." "What will you do with this information?" "At the moment, nothing. But I do like to have plans for everything, just in case. After all, I have to be realistic, right?" Izuku turned to leave after getting what he wanted from the man. "Is this all from that day?" Yagi asked to his back. "Most of them, yes." Yagi paused and then, "I'm sore dash." He was cut off by Izuku turning around with cold eyes. "Oh? You are sorry? Is it because I'm a threat to you and your apprentice instead of some quirkless child on the roof?" The venom that dripped from his words caused All Might to flinch back. Izuku turned back around and left Yagi standing there alone, with a whirl of emotions running through him. He did his best to calm down as he walked away from the symbol of peace. It felt cathartic to go on a rant like that, especially when it felt like a villain monologue before an epic battle. He wonders if the fight between All Might and the All for One had a monologue like that. He reran through the expressions on Yagi's face and his electrical signals as he spoke to him, and everything he gained from the interaction pointed at Izuku being right about everything. He remembered how the low electrical energy in Yagi's mind surged every time Izuku pointed at his findings. By the time he found who he was looking for, he had calmed down enough not to snap at someone unnecessarily. Izuku was wary of trying to take this energy because it was something that could cause catastrophic damage if he didn't realize the consequences of using it like he did with thermal or kinetic. If he absorbed kinetic energy or thermal energy, it would replenish or there would be no harm in taking it. But some energies could damage something in the long term if he used it wrong or at all. But the more he thought about it, the more confidence he gained in using the energy, since he most likely wasn't the first to use it regularly and everything seemed fine.
"Ah, Midoriya?
Is everything all right? You've been watching me for a while now," Uraraka asked nervously. Izuku snapped out of his contemplation. "Sorry, Uraraka. I was lost in thought, but I was looking for you." He unlatched his lower mask and let it dangle down to his chest. "Oh? What did you need? Uraraka looked more relaxed and approached him with a smile. Could you use your quirk on me? Izuku asked and held his hand out like he was going to shake hands with her. She tilted her head but shrugged and took his hand, and then his body shimmering for a brief moment. She held on to him just in case. Why did you want me to do that? She looked up at him now floating above her head. When I gain a new energy, I need to see it or sense it. I've always sensed your quirk negate the gravitational energy on the object you use it on, but I always worried about using it and the ramifications of taking it. But now the longer I think about it, it should be fine. Izuku rambled on and expanded his sixth sense in search of the difference between him and the area around him. His eyes snapped open and he found what he was looking for. A primal energy that rooted everything and everyone on the earth except for him. Uraraka's eyes widened as she began to float just like Izuku, but she didn't use her quirk on herself. Soon, rocks and dust on the ground began to float as well by her and the area surrounding the smiling green-haired boy. She released her quirk, but everything continued floating away from the ground in a radius around them. Holy shit, she whispered in awe of the mimicry of her quirk's effects. Izuku continued to smile and slowly stopped absorbing the new energy that settled in his core. He hummed in satisfaction at the successful experiment as they settled back on firm ground. Thank you, Uraraka. If you ever need my help with anything, I'd be happy to do so, he said seriously as he locked eyes with her. Uraraka nodded apprehensively and looked away while fidgeting with her hands. She looked back and asked, You helped the others with their quirks. Mina, Toru, Kyuka, Kaminari, and Shiro. Can you do the same with me? Izuku smiled broadly and nodded happily. Of course, I'd be happy to, but that doesn't count as the favor you helped me with. Uraraka smiled back in relief and gave him a nod. Thank you, Midoriya. Show me your quirk on a few objects and yourself. She nodded with determination and went over to the large concrete blocks she had been using a moment ago. She tapped a few of them and some smaller stones on the ground. Izuku got close and watched everything with his newest sixth sense. He furrowed his brows and then looked at Uraraka. His eyes furrowed further at seeing gravitational energy in her body. Drop everything and use it on one object, he instructed. Izuku watched Uraraka's body dispel the gravitational energy and the blocks regain it from the area around them. She went over and tapped one block, and Izuku watched in fascination as for a small moment the energy in the block transferred from the block and into Uraraka. He asked her to do it again and the energy built up inside her. He asked her next to use it on herself, and oddly enough the same thing happened, but the energy inside her body was riled up. He had known of Uraraka's weakness of using her quirk on herself, which caused her intense nausea, and prolonged use on other things caused the same. Izuku motioned her down and asked, What does it feel when you touch something to use your quirk? Like a pulling sensation. Izuku had his hand cupped around his chin, but his eyes glimmered at his theory. Uraraka looked a bit surprised and nodded vigorously. It does. She was excited as she could tell her classmate figured something out in such a short time. You're just like me. She looked confused and he explained. When you use your quirk on something, the gravitational energy is sucked into your body. When I use my quirk, I do the same and release when I want. But you contain the gravitational energy of the object you touch, which causes it to float. The reason you get nauseous when you use it on yourself is that the energy moves around inside your body in a loop. You took it away, but it's still inside you, thus the nausea. He explained excitedly. Uraraka looked like she was having the revelation of her life. So if I... She went over to the blocks and then tapped multiple ones and then held the last one in her hands. She furrowed her brows in concentration. Push instead. Her finger pressed hard into the concrete. Suddenly, the concrete shimmered again, but dark purple instead of the usual pink. The concrete block slammed down with incredible force, causing the ground to spiderweb under it as it continued to push down with the force of multiple concrete blocks into one. She shrieked in surprise and jumped back. Izuku looked excitedly at his successful theory and the dense energy contained inside the concrete block that belonged to the other concrete blocks that continued to float. He looked over to Uraraka to see her looking at him in complete euphoria at having discovered a completely new aspect of her quirk. He smiled widely back at her and then waved goodbye to play around with the new energy that was all around him. Do be careful if used on a person. Also, keep an eye on your limits. This might drain you faster than how you've usually used your quirk. With that, he left. Chapter 39. Secrets and Talks. For the rest of the week, Izuku played around with his newest energy, and boy did he have fun floating around. Of course, his friends joined in floating around with him when he told them about the primal energy he had gained. He practiced using gravitational energy to fly to some degree. He absorbed the energy around his body and used small kinetic blasts to move him around like pressurized gas in space. It did take him many trials and errors to figure out the mechanics of it, but he was on his way to being able to fly. When he wasn't practicing with the new energy, he visited Eri. The next time he did so, he brought his friends like he told her he would. He invited Uraraka and Tsuyu as well since they were part of the raid and were eager to meet the girl. Eri was very shy in the beginning but slowly calmed down at their easy personalities. Tsuyu was very drawn to the girl since she was the same age as her sister. They hung around her when they got the chance and she grew more relaxed around them as time passed. Eri was still most comfortable around Izuku when people were around. She began to regain her health bit by bit every time Izuku visited her. Back at the school, Izuku was trying to use gravitational energy to stop clones of ectoplasm by sending them crashing into the ground with controlled bursts of increased gravity. It wasn't precise like his lightning or fire beam and was more like a ray that increased gravity where he aimed. It was extremely effective in downing anyone that got near him and a great non-lethal attack. He was taking a break when Denki approached him with a grin. "Hey Izuku, I've got an idea." Izuku stopped drinking his water to eye his friend with suspicion. "What? Have you ever seen any old animes?" "Not really." "Why?" "Well, in some, there is a training method that they use by working out in a high-gravity area." "I was just wondering." Izuku paused, unsure. "Denki, I don't think that's a good idea." "Oh, come on. We'll start slow and I'll walk into the range." Denki looked excitedly and motioned him to stand. "What are you two doing?" Sato asked. "Something stupid and dangerous, probably," Izuku said. "I'll be fine. Izuku can increase the gravity and dash." "I'm in." Sato cut him off with a serious face. Izuku shook his head at the two and sighed in resignation. He scorched the ground in a cone shape with the narrow where he stood and then increased the gravity in front of him by a small degree. "Go ahead." He waved in front of him. The two grinned like idiots and stepped inside the cone. They buckled slightly but stood straight after a second. They moved around to get used to the increased gravity and then grinned at Izuku. "More!" the two shouted in unison. Izuku pursed his lips but obliged by increasing the energy output. The two stained to keep upright, but they slowly did so. Denki activated his quirk and strengthened his body with electricity, and Sato brought a bag of sugar to his mouth slowly as he fought against the increased difficulty. When they were done with their preparation, they tried to spar, but it was at a quarter movement speed at most. Soon, more of his classmates joined in to watch the two try to spar, but they were more interested as to see why they were so sluggish. Denki was sweating buckets as he gave up his fight against Sato and made his way to exit the increased gravity. When he did, he stumbled out and took in a breath. "That was intense," he gasped out. Sato followed him and fell to his knees next to him. "I feel like I benched, squatted, and curled a truck. What's with them?" Toru came up to Izuku. "They were inside the increased gravity for training, I guess?" He shrugged. "Increased gravity, you say?" Kirishima appeared next to Izuku in a flash. Kirishima, Shoji, and Ojiro were next in the field, and they struggled just as much as the other two in their attempt to fight against the primal energy that was gravity. Kirishima cheated a bit by hardening his joints, but the weight was still on his shoulders. Shoji manipulated his arms slowly around while Ojiro went through a fighting routine with difficulty. By the end, they were all in a similar state as Denki and Sato when they got out. "You guys done having fun?" Izuku asked with a raised brow at the five on the ground. "Don't you look at us with those judging eyes." Denki groaned. "Have you tried it out?" "Of course not, I just collapse. I'm not made for strength." Izuku shrugged. He sensed a new presence getting close and he had a good feeling about who it was. "Are you all going to continue wasting time?" Aizawa's voice came from behind Izuku. Izuku looked over his shoulder at his teacher and then turned back around to most of his class. He gave them a brief nod and walked past them to a spot to continue his experiments with his quirk. The class broke apart to continue their training. The class was very aware of Izuku's dislike of their homeroom teacher, but no one ever brought it up to discuss it. As he sat down, he still felt the eyes on the back of his head as he made balls of energy combine. He didn't acknowledge the underground hero as he merged the effects of fire without gravity or with increased gravity. Nezu wants a word with you. Aizawa finally spoke. Tell him I'm going to sell the information if he is afraid of me doing so. Izuku didn't turn to speak and continued to work on his quirk. It wasn't a request. Before Aizawa used his quirk on the boy, he was shrouded in the void. He shot his capture weapon at Izuku and it wrapped him up for a moment before his back incinerated the part holding him. I was always curious as to how this worked, Izuku said, holding up the part that wasn't burned away to his eyes. The minor mutation that causes your hair to float comes from your father, and the quirk erasure from your mother, but this is something different, he said absent-mindedly. Izuku held onto it and got up. Walking past an irate and shocked Aizawa, he said, "You should get more sleep," and drained some of his stamina away to make him stumble from the intense drowsiness. Instead of going to Nezu's office, he went to an open field so he didn't cause collateral damage to anyone nearby in the gym. He continued his experiments by absorbing the gravity in the area, which caused him to float with any loose debris coming with him. He pushed anything away from him by releasing a small amount of kinetic energy in every direction and began. First, he began with small streams of compressed thermal energy as a form of propulsion. It worked and it launched him into where he wanted, but he miscalculated and began to spin. He then overcompensated, which caused him to spin more erratically. He huffed in slight frustration, dropping from the air and absorbing the fall. He lay on the grass and stared into the cloudy sky in thought. He sensed another thermal signature and looked over to see Mirio walking over to him with a stiff smile. "Mirio," he greeted and sat up. "Working on a movement technique, I see. It's always hard and embarrassing at the beginning. I remember when I first worked on mine, I crashed into so many walls." He laughed at the memory. Izuku let him ramble on and try to start a conversation but didn't say anything. He knew he wanted to speak about his secret. Mirio looked down at his underclassman when he didn't hear anything from him and saw him staring at Mirio with curiosity. "Ah, right. I suppose you have an idea why I'm here," he said while his smile dropped and his laughter petered out. "You were waiting in Nezu's office, and when Aizawa told him I wasn't coming, you came to me instead of him or Yagi. I'm guessing." He shrugged casually. Mirio was reminded of how similar Midoriya was to Sir Night-Eye with his analytical mind. "You and Sir are eerily similar. What's it called?" "I'm sorry," Mirio asked, confused. "The quirk, what's it called?" Mirio paused and felt his fingers go cold at how much Midoriya truly knew of the legacy he took. He remembered how much All Might and Sir emphasized how much the secret was worth. He debated with himself and finally told him. "One for all." Izuku nodded slowly and immediately connected the dots between the boogeyman of the first era and the quirk. He could even guess that the mysterious villain that killed every past holder was All for One. Did All for One kill the previous holders of One for All? He sighed and rubbed his neck. "You sure know a lot." "Yeah, he did." He paused and asked, "Why go through all that effort to find answers?" He finally asked what he was sent out to ask. "Curiosity." He shrugged. "I like quirks and yours wasn't right. The more I dug, the deeper it went, and I like to know things about people around me, especially from people who hold lots of power. Whether that be political, physical, or anything in between." "Why? Wouldn't you want to know everything about possible threats?" he asked as it was obvious. "Possible threats? You believe me to be a threat? Everyone you gathered information about?" Mirio asked with slight offense. "Anyone and everyone could become a threat. That's very cynical." Izuku shrugged and got up. "That isn't bad. It's what you do with it. Did you come for what you wanted? Or did you have more questions?" His eyes were drawn to something odd about Mirio and he stared. He let out a long sigh. "Why do you hate All Might so much? He's done so much for Japan. He's a hypocrite," he said absent-mindedly and stared more intently. "What do you mean?" "Yes, All Might is a great hero and has good morals. But Yagi Toshinori was born quirkless. He knew what it was like to be beaten down, but he left me on the roof after telling me to give up on being a hero. And then he continued to defend the same student who told me to kill myself the same day even after he was arrested, and he is still in my class. He explained calmly. His eyes stopped glaring at Mirio and went back to what he was trying to figure out. Mirio had heard of what All Might did to Midoriya, but not the rest. He had to once again look at the previous #1 hero in a new light. As far as he knew, Midoriya wasn't one to lie, and that dug deeper into his views on the hero. He was going to speak again, but noticed Midoriya's eyes not on him, but something on him. "What is it?" he asked, confused. "Mirio, does anyone in your family have gray hair as a mutation?" "What?" He was thrown off kilter at the sudden question. "Not that I know of. Why?" Midoriya hummed in thought and cupped his chin. After a moment, he approached Mirio and plucked a hair from his head. "Ow! Hey, you're graying at a young age. Heavy stress? Or something else?" He showed the strand of hair that was blonde at the tip and gray at the root. Mirio stared at the hair in his hand and took it, examining it. "Is there more?" He tilted his head down so Midoriya could see. Izuku checked and saw that most of his roots were beginning to gray. "All of it." Mirio looked uneasy at the response. "I don't think I'm that stressed out." He ran his fingers through his hair. "You think I'll turn out to be a gray fox?" He tried to joke, but the laughter that came with it was forced. "You should go see a doctor. Did Yagi's predecessor, Ms. Maverick, have any adverse effects of having two quirks? I've never heard of anyone with two quirks, other than All for One and the Nomu, and how they could affect the person. I'm sure there have been experiments, but..." He trailed off with a shrug. "Those were hidden away somewhere probably." Mirio continued to look more nervous as he spoke. "I don't know much about her other than All Might looked up to her." He pulled his hand out of his now messy hair and looked at the few strands that came with it. Some were blonde and more were gray at the root, like Midoriya said. "I need to go." Izuku watched him turn on his heels and begin to walk away stiffly. His eyes turned to the figure at the window that was watching him. It was Yagi, and he had a frown on his face at seeing his successor's actions. Izuku shrugged and turned back to his training. He wanted to find a way to become a jet fighter. He smirked to himself at the thought and began to float again. The week after Mirio came to talk to Izuku went by without any incident. Izuku visited Eri at the hospital with his friends. Her eyes lit up when she saw the group every time they came through the doors. She has been slowly gaining a healthy amount of weight, and the doctors have been saying she will be free to leave soon. Izuku was happy for her recovery. During the weekend, Izuku took Toru out on a date to enjoy themselves. It was a simple affair of going to a mall and going for a walk in the park. It wasn't anything special, but the two enjoyed their peaceful time together. Toru brought up the idea of the whole group going out together as they did before. Izuku was happy to do so when they got the chance. Finally, Monday came and Izuku was again called to Nezu's office. The absorber sighed and went to meet with the principal. He knocked on the door and it opened to see Nezu behind his desk and Aizawa on the couch. Seeing the usually disheveled man reminded him to look closer at the support item he took from Aizawa.
Midoriya, come in.
"Would you like some tea?" Nezu greeted jovially. "I'll pass. What is it you wish to discuss?" He didn't sit down and waited. "Very well." He let out a small sigh. "I want to know how long it took you to find what you did?" His beady eyes flickered to Aizawa and back to Izuku. Izuku raises a brow. "A day and a half. This wasn't what you wanted to talk about, is it?" He knew it wasn't from the brief look he gave to Aizawa. "Truly." Nezu sounded surprised at his answer and went over the question posed. "What got your research started?" he asked in curiosity. "His yearbook." Nezu's eyes flickered side to side as if he were reading the yearbook. He slowly began to nod in understanding at his process. He typed in his computer for a moment and sat back after briefly reading what was on the screen. He turned back to the student before him. "You would have been a great detective." Izuku didn't say anything and waited for him to get to the reason he was called to the office. He knew it wasn't about one for all since Aizawa didn't know from his glances between the two. "Very well, the main reason I called you in here was to inform you that young Eri will be released tomorrow. You said you wanted to guide her to control her quirk. Is that still true?" Nezu asked with his paws steepled before his snout. It is, I'm guessing, Aizawa to help in that regard? Very astute. Yes, Aizawa will help or watch over her when you are unable to or otherwise. As you know, he would be just as capable of handling her quirk as you can. All her necessities will be acquired for her very soon, and she will have a room attached to Eraserheads in the dorms. Her education? Izuku asked. I will be tutoring her. I have enough free time to do so, Nezu responded. Does the commission know about her? Izuku asked. Nezu stopped from continuing to answer anything he said and processed what he had asked. In an even tone, he asked, Why do you ask? I don't trust them. And if there is a chance to have a quirk under their control that could bring someone from the dead, then they might do what they can to get their hands on her. What makes you distrust of the hero commission? Nezu asked carefully. Izuku looked back with a raised brow. It took me less than 2 days to find what I did. I did a lot of research before UA. I didn't have too many friends, as you can imagine. That combined with my curiosity about finding what I shouldn't led me to some interesting things. More so when I came here and got to interact with the son of the number 2 hero at the time. Oh, Nezu probed. Where did Hawks come from? He asked simply. And who did he replace? Nezu smirked and nodded. The commission knows a raid took place and we rescued a child. They know UA is taking her as a ward. They will suspect something. There is nothing to do about that unless we forge a fake quirk registration. It wouldn't be hard, Izuku mumbled, but Nezu's ears twitched at hearing it. Was there anything else? No, that will be all. I wouldn't mind having you return to discuss less pressing matters over a cup of tea, Nezu offered. Izuku thought about it and nodded. All right. He was curious about what the two could dive into as a discussion. Wonderful. Anything I can help you with? Nezu clapped his paws together with a smile. What of Mirio? Nezu's smile fell just a bit, but Izuku caught it. Nothing to worry about. The absorber nodded and headed out of the office. Aizawa stared at the door he left through and could only think of what else he could know if he knew to distrust the hero commission. He was reminded of how the absorber knew about his parents' quirks. On top of that, Nezu kept something hidden about Mirio which the absorber knew and caused Yagi intense distress when he saw him last. Chapter 40 Eri. Izuku and Aizawa got out of the car and began to walk to the entrance of the hospital where Eri had been staying for the past month. The two didn't speak the whole time from leaving the school to arriving at the hospital, and Izuku was happy to keep it that way. It didn't take long to make their way to her room. They found Eri finishing dressing with the help of an old nurse with a kind smile. Her eyes lit up at seeing Izuku but became wary at seeing Aizawa's disheveled appearance. Izuku smirked at that and waited for her to finish up. Ready to go? The nurse asked with a gentle smile once she finished. Eri nodded at the nurse and turned to Izuku. He smiled down at her and asked, Got everything? She was about to nod again but stopped and shook her head and pointed at Izuku's jacket that still was hung up where he had left it. Your jacket, of course. Izuku laughed a bit and took his jacket for the coat stand. He slipped it on and held out a hand to Eri. Now we're ready. Eri took his hand and they headed down to the waiting car. The little girl looked around at the new environment but stuck close to Izuku and clung to his hand tightly. He smiled reassuringly down to her and helped her get into the car's back seat. He sat beside her as Aizawa started up the car and began to make his way back to the school. Where are we going? Eri asked in a soft voice. We are going to go to a school where he works. He pointed at Aizawa. And where I go to learn how to be a hero. He explained. Is that where I'll stay? Yep. You'll have a room next to his and I'll live in the same building as you. The rest of my class is staying there too. Your friends that came with you? She asked with just a bit of eagerness slipping through. That's right, we'll all be nearby. Izuku smiled at the emotion that she showed. Is everyone in your class nice like them? Izuku's smile didn't slip, but he paused for a second. None of them will ever hurt you, I promise. He patted her head. Okay. Eri thought up another question. What will I do? She looked up at him in question. Izuku hummed in thought. Lots of things. You will go to school and learn about things like reading, writing, math, and other stuff. You can learn a hobby like drawing or anything you like. And later we'll teach you how to use your quirk. Eri showed fear in the last part of Izuku's explanation. But it's dangerous and bad. Izuku stroked her hair gently to calm her down like he had done many times before while visiting her at the hospital. There is no such thing as bad quirks, only people who use them for bad things, and you are not bad. He made sure she heard his words and continued when he saw her listening. Think of a person with a quirk that made them super strong. That person could help another person lift something heavy so they could get to safety, or the same person could use it to hurt people. Eri listened attentively to his words and relaxed under his hands, brushing her hair. She stiffened at his next words. Overhaul is an evil man who did evil things, and I'm glad he will never hurt anyone again. But his quirk could have helped so many people. The quirk is not bad, only the person. And I'll help you learn how to use your quirk so you'll never have to worry about it again. He smiled gently down at her and put his hand over her shoulder to pull her in for a hug. She nodded tentatively, and they rode back to school in a comfortable silence. It wasn't long before they drove through the security gate and stopped inside the UA walls. Eri looked around at the big building they stopped at, and then at Izuku, who was smiling down at her curiosity. Is that the school? Eri asked as they began to walk to the entrance. No, that's the dorms. Where we live, and you will too. They were about to open the doors but stopped Aizawa from doing so when he remembered something. Aizawa, wait a second. Eraserhead turned around and gave him a questioning look. Tokoyami. That is all that Izuku said, and let him figure it out from there. Who's that? Eri asked, confused at their pause. Izuku knelt to talk to her eye to eye. You know how there are quirks that change people's appearances. Some have tools that are part of their bodies like hammers or tape. And then some people with animal quirks like cows, frogs, and birds. He paused to make sure she understood so far. Eri nodded and he continued. Well, there is one boy in our class, our dorm, who has a bird mutation. His head looks like a bird's head. Izuku saw the connection between the unknown boy and Overhaul's mask. He could see the mounting trepidation. But he's here, Izuku nodded. He's learning to become a hero like me. He's a good guy that looks like one of the bad guys. When you grow up, you'll see lots of people like that. They look scary but aren't bad. Eri paused to understand what he was saying and nodded. Okay, Izuku smiled brilliantly at her and stood back up to Aizawa, who was looking at him with an unreadable expression. His smile dropped at seeing him. We're ready, he said, clipped. Aizawa didn't scowl back or make a face, but instead turned around and opened the dorm doors to the common room. The sound of chatter stopped, and most of the class looked over to the open doors. The class spotted the three figures and were momentarily confused, since any time Izuku and Aizawa got near each other there would always be friction, but the little girl between the two was enough buffer to stop the sparks from flying. The next thing they noticed was the child between them. A few of them recognized the girl and smiled brilliantly at seeing her. Eri, you're here. Mina was the first to speak. She threw herself over the back of the couch toward the little girl and landed near her to greet her. I'm so happy to see you out of that place. Mina beamed at her. Hi, Mina. Eri greeted Izuku's energetic friend. The rest of Izuku's gang quickly circled the little girl with Uraraka and Tsuyu also nearby with smiles. The rest of the class began to get close, and Eri began to tighten her grip on Izuku's hand at seeing so many people focused on her. Izuku noticed immediately, and everything stopped making noise for a second to make everyone pause. Should I explain the situation? Izuku snarked to Aizawa. The man glared at the boy and turned back to the class. This is Eri. She will be staying with us for the foreseeable future. She'll have a room connected to mine, but you'll see her often. I do not have to remind you to comport yourselves appropriately around a child. He glared at the class to get his point across without having to say anything else. After a moment of quiet, Yairuzo asked, May we ask why she will be staying at UA? She asked politely, and many others nodded. She was rescued recently from a villain organization, and we deemed it a good idea to keep her here, while also helping her get her quirk under control. Aizawa drawled. Midoriya and I will be the ones near her most of the time in case we need to neutralize her quirk. What is it? Sato raised his hand to ask. Rewinding of organic matter, Izuku said before Aizawa spoke. If you see her glow, don't touch her. Izuku smiled down at her to reassure her and patted her head softly. Yairuzo mumbled something to herself and was lost in thought. She looked up after a moment. She can reverse the aging of organic matter? She asked incredulously, extremely quickly. Maybe when she gets more practice, it will be more controlled. Izuku nodded along. Is it appropriate for a first year to take care of a child? Ida spoke out. I've taken care of my siblings when I was even younger. Tsuyu shot back in defense of her green-haired classmate. She had seen how he had looked after the girl while they visited the hospital, and she was sure he would be good for Eri. Izuku ignored Ida and crouched down to Eri's level. "Wanna see your room?" he asked with a smile. Eri nodded, and they parted from the class and followed Aizawa to his room. It was on the ground level of the dorms. Aizawa opened it, and Izuku guided Eri in while looking around at the apartment with a private kitchen and all the other necessities for living. It was well organized with a comfortable-looking couch in the living room and a TV next to it. The kitchen was well stocked with fresh fruits and other foods for a child to eat. Aizawa motioned to the door to the side and where Eri's room was. Izuku opened the room. He glanced around quickly and took it in before letting Eri go in and explore her new room. He smiled warmly at seeing her look around her room. She peeked in the closet and through each drawer to see new clothes in every place. "Have you taken care of children before?" Aizawa asked to Izuku's side by the doorway of Eri's room. "Never. Parents didn't like the idea of a quirkless teen to look after their child," Izuku said with a dead tone to his voice. Aizawa watched him for a moment before asking, "Then how is it you know how to look after her?" Izuku raised a brow at his question. "You explain things for her to understand and make sure she knows things like Tokoyami being who he is ahead of time." Izuku hummed incomprehensive at what his question was. "You're asking how I know how to look after a child." Izuku caught the nod from the corner of his eye while he kept watching over Eri. "For me it's simple. Give her everything I didn't." Aizawa didn't respond for a long time while also watching Eri look around her room. "I see." Eri approached Izuku and he smiled down at her. "You like your room?" Eri nodded and asked, "Is this all for me?" The two men nodded. "Oh, okay. What's wrong?" Izuku asked softly. Eri paused to get her words in order. "It's a lot." Izuku nodded. "It can be. It's a big change from what was before to now, but it's better, no?" Eri nodded slowly and then looked at Izuku. "Where is your room? I'll show you." He smiled brilliantly and held out a hand to her. She took it and the two left Aizawa behind. Izuku showed her how to use the elevator to find the right floor and showed her which room was his. He opened the door of his room and welcomed her in. She walked in tentatively and looked around at the plain room with a few drawings hung up of Toru with their friends together or just Izuku and her. "Now you know if you need anything you can come to my room if you like. If that's in the middle of the night, then come in the middle of the night, alright? I don't want to wake you," Eri said softly. "It's fine. I can be awake for longer than others could." He had experimented with the stamina energy he had taken from the Yakuza raid and it turned out very useful. The only downside of using stamina to stay awake was that his mind became slower after longer periods. "Okay." Eri accepted his offer and then her stomach growled. She blushed slightly. Izuku laughed softly and went to the door. "Let's go eat. I'm sure I can find something good to cook up for you." Izuku held out a hand for her and they walked downstairs to the kitchen. The absorber helped Eri up on a chair on the counter. Izuku rounded the counter to the fridge to look at what he had to work with and turned around to ask her what she would like to eat. Instead of just Eri, he found his friends seated around her waiting eagerly for him. "So what are you cooking for us?" Mina asked, seated next to Eri with an arm around the girl in a hug. "I'm partial to a burger with fries," Denki voted. "You'll get what you're severed." Izuku mock glared at the two. "What would you like to eat?" he asked more kindly to Eri. Eri looked unsure. She had never had an option to choose what she wanted to eat. The gang picked up on this and gave her some options from what Izuku told them what he had the ingredients for. They ended up cooking up a simple pasta for the girl with Toru helping him at the stove with the pasta sauce. Mina giggled quietly at the scene of the two cooking for the girl, but didn't say anything, but the look Kyuka gave her made it obvious what she was thinking. Eri devoured her plate of pasta and they gave her another one when she finished. The gang chatted quietly around Eri as they ate comfortably. The child listened to them talk but was content to be left out of it, with Kyuka being in the same boat as the girl. When everyone finished eating and cleaning the plates, they moved to Izuku's room to play a few board games and teach Eri how to play. Everyone was patient with Eri as she learned how to play, but everyone was having fun. The next day brought Izuku to the field with Eri and Aizawa. Eri had a miniature UA gym uniform which Izuku found adorable. The three were near a few bushes they were going to use as target practice. "All right, you ready, Eri?" Izuku asked to her side. Eri looked extremely nervous at the prospect of using her quirk for the first time voluntarily. "Are you sure?" "Yep. I can be near you anytime, and if you can't turn it off, then Aizawa will do that for you." "See?" Izuku held out a hand with a void covering it, and it disappeared after Aizawa got the message to use his quirk on him. "He can shut quirks off, and I can absorb your energy, so we'll all be safe." He smiled reassuringly at her. "Okay." Eri agreed with his logic. "For now, just focus on turning on and off your quirk. We can work on control later." Aizawa spoke. Eri nodded and walked closer to the bush. She closed her eyes and scrunched up her face. After a long moment, nothing happened. "I can't, I'm sorry." She looked down ashamed. "It's fine. We are practicing. Just because you can't do it right away doesn't mean you can't do it later." Izuku reassured her. "Let's try something else, visualization." "What?" Eri asked, confused. "Imaging your quirk as something you can understand. For my quirk, I imagine I have lots of big containers that can hold the energy I want, and at the bottom of each container is a big opening for me to let out each energy I want." Izuku explained by slowly draining away the light in his hand, and in the other, a light became brighter and brighter. "What should I imagine?" Eri asked, getting the concept Izuku was telling her. "I think for your quirk, it should be a container like mine that fills up slowly with a hose at the bottom. The hose at the bottom will release the energy you have." "Why that?" Eri asked, curious. "Because you have something called a stockpile quirk. It's a quirk that fills up and then you can use it when you have enough energy. Some quirks are like switches that can be turned on and off like his." He pointed at Aizawa, who was listening attentively to him. "Some quirks, like yours, need to build up energy to use them, and when you run out, you can't use it until later." "How do you know that Eri has a stockpile quirk?" Aizawa asked Izuku. "I can sense energies, and more detailed if I already absorbed that energy. I sense Eri's quirk energy slowly filling up every time I visit her." "From what?" "No clue." Izuku shrugged. "Quirk energy is weird from what I've learned." "Okay. Try it out, Eri." Aizawa prompted the girl. "Just imagine a big container holding your energy and open the hose at the bottom." Izuku encouraged. Eri focused and repeated the word "open" over and over until she began to glow and the grass under her began to regress into the ground. She opened her eyes and looked frightened for a moment before seeing Izuku's beaming smile. "I did it," Eri said. "You did." Izuku threw his hands up in celebration. "Now let's try to close the hose," Izuku instructed gently. Eri nodded and closed her eyes again to try and cut off her quirk. She continued to glow without change. Slowly the glow diminished, but some remained coming off of her. "I can't do it." "But you did. You just have a little left to close. Try once again," Izuku encouraged. She closed her eyes and pursed her lips in concentration but slumped in defeat. "I can't," tears cropping up at the corners of her eyes. "It's all right. You'll get it next time." Izuku patted her head without her quirk affecting him. Her quirk suddenly cut off and Eri looked up to see Aizawa's red eye on hers before he blinked and they were back to normal. "Next time," Izuku said encouragingly. Chapter 41. School festival comes. Izuku's routine stayed the same for the most part for the coming month. He would wake up, get ready for school, train, pick up Eri from Nezu, and once a week they would help Eri gain control of her quirk. He of course did play games with the child when he had a chance. His friends would join in more than not at goofing off with the Eri. Usually it would be board games with Eri learning how to play as they went along. Bit by bit, Eri began to relax in the new environment of the dorms. One day while Izuku was floating in the backyard with Eri at his side, Aizawa came to check on them. His homeroom teacher was kind to Eri but was more of a guardian than a parental figure to her. When she needed something, he would do his best to help. For Izuku, that was acceptable in her circumstances. It would be odd if he suddenly became fatherly to a child they had rescued somewhat recently. He was sure he had rescued plenty of other children without getting attached. It would become difficult to be a hero if every time he did save a kid, he would become fixated on them. That was something Izuku learned from his observation. When he saved a kid's life, he couldn't take them in as he had done with Eri. It would be unreasonable and unfeasible. He would have to come to accept that. "Hi, Mr. Aizawa. Wanna join?" Eri lowered her book and asked him while floating next to Izuku. Her hair was tied into a braid thanks to Mina and Tsuyu, otherwise it would be a mess with it all loose in low gravity. Aizawa's lips quirked up a fraction but shook his head. "No, thank you, Eri. I came to talk to Midoriya for a moment." He nodded to Izuku, who was watching him. Eri nodded and Izuku set her down gently on her feet. "Go on and ask Denki to make you a snack." Izuku patted her head gently and smiled down at her. Eri nodded and darted off into the kitchen in search of the electric-type user to make her food. Izuku smirked at seeing her run off, but his smile dropped as he turned to Aizawa, who was watching him carefully. "You wish to talk?" Izuku began. He nodded after a moment. "How has she been doing outside of classes?" The absorber thought for a moment and shrugged. "As well as you can imagine. She's adjusting well enough given her circumstances. She's getting used to being allowed to ask questions and other things she wasn't allowed to do before." Aizawa took in his student's words and nodded. He paused for a moment before speaking. "The school festival is coming up." He said it in a too casual way and grimaced slightly. Izuku stared at the man for a long second. "Nezu told you to play nice, didn't he?" He couldn't see any other reason for the hero to give him a heads up about an upcoming event. The same hero who was renounced for his logical ruse that caused so much grief in the past years. Aizawa didn't answer right away but finally nodded. "Why?" Izuku asked. "The principal's mind is on a different level compared to us." I long stopped trying to figure out his thought process. Izuku could think up a few reasons why Nezu would ask or order Aizawa to become more amenable. First and foremost would be so Izuku wouldn't become a threat to UA or Japan as a whole. He was very aware of the kind of devastation he could cause if he gave in to his darkest thoughts. Second, Nezu wants him as an ally he can call upon when needed. That would be an added benefit with reason 1. Third, Nezu thinks Izuku could be a big enough power to stop an unknown enemy of Nezu. The League of Villains was still out there, and so were all for one's old subordinates. Fourth, Nezu wanted to develop a friendship with Izuku. He discarded the last idea with a snort. Instead of telling Aizawa his thoughts on Nezu's reasoning, he let it be for the time being. "Was there anything else you wanted to discuss?" "That was all." Izuku nodded and headed inside to see how Eri was doing and what Denki made for her. While he did trust Denki to keep her safe, his dietary habits are worrisome. When he walked in, he had nothing to worry about since Kyuka took over for Denki when she saw him begin to pull ice cream and chocolate syrup from the fridge. Kyuka instead neatly sliced up an apple for Eri, who patiently waited at the counter. Izuku joined her in waiting in one of the chairs. When she looked over to see who sat next to her, he smiled warmly in greeting. The rest of Sunday night passed without much fanfare or incidents. The next morning, Izuku and Toru walk hand in hand to class. The other gang members walked around them, chatting animatedly between each other. Uraraka and Tsuyu were near their group. The two had become closer to Izuku's group since the raid on the Hasaikai compound, and more especially with Uraraka coming to Izuku for help with the new facet of her quirk he had shown her. He had also helped Tsuyu with her quirk, but to a lesser degree than Uraraka's. It's more difficult to help with animalistic quirks than an emitter quirk that Izuku could see easily. He did mention that there were a variety of tree frogs that she could adapt to, but it would be a long shot. After all, poison dart frogs are adjacent to tree frogs. Once everyone was seated in the classroom and the bell rang, Aizawa walked through the door as tired as ever. "Listen up, the school festival is coming up. So, prepare an event or whatever." With that, he wandered to his desk and slipped under it for sleep. Yairuzo and Ida stood up to begin their duties as class representatives. They weren't very effective at the beginning when there was excited chatter amongst the whole class. Izuku stayed out of it for the most part since he never had any interest in the festival in middle school. "What do you think, Zu?" Toru asked him. She had gathered near his desk with the others in their friend group. Izuku held his hands up and shrugged. "I was never interested in the school festival before, right? That would make sense. Denki nodded as he remembered what their leader had told them about his less-than-enjoyable past. Come on, I say dance off. Mina proposed again with Izuku paying attention. How many of us know how to dance? I don't. Hanta raised his hand and so did Izuku. All right, we'll be taking ideas and see what sticks. Yairuzo got everyone's attention. She had chalk in hand and was ready to write on the blackboard. Who's got an idea?
Mina.
Dance competition. Yairuzo began to write on the board as the class shouted out ideas, with a few being shot down immediately. Maid cafe. Denki shouted and was properly slapped on the back of his head. Izuku, back me up here? He looked to his leader for support on either the idea or being abused by the girls. Izuku's eyes went blank for a moment in the imagination of seeing Toru in such a maid outfit. Before his face could get any color in it, he shrouded himself in darkness to hide his face.
No más café.
His jealous mind brought up the idea of Toru being eyed by others, and he didn't like it.
No más café.
The boss has spoken. Hanta nodded along with him, but he didn't hide a smirk at Izuku's obvious reasoning for hiding his face. Ida scoffed at them as Yairuzo continued to take ideas from the class until the bell rang and the next class began. The day continued as normal until lunch, when the gang sat together. Mina was the first to bring up Izuku's reaction during class. So, Izuku. Mina pronounced his name one syllable at a time and bumped shoulders with his. What did you shoot down the maid cafe? Didn't you want to see Toru in a maid outfit? She teased. Izuku had begun to get accustomed to the energetic pink girl's teasing, but her mention of Toru in a maid outfit did make him hide his face in the void of his quirk. He still felt his face heat up at the mere idea of Toru in such a dress. There. He did it again. Mina pointed at Izuku's face, which was covered in the darkest black. Toru slapped Mina's hand down. Leave him alone. Izuku, you don't have to answer that. Just tell me later. She leaned into him and gave him a wink only he could see. I just don't like the idea of people leering at my friends. The festival is something that is supposed to be fun. Not that. Izuku waved his hand in an attempt at an explanation. The boss is a good boss, Hanta stated as he ate his food. So what do you guys think we should do then? Kyuka asked the table. Denki pointed at her with his chopsticks. You know music, we could do a concert. I'm sure others know an instrument. Kyuka's ears burned slightly at the idea. That's an amazing idea, Mina said over Kyuka, trying to get her head in order. She finally managed to do so and shook her head. She raised her hands in surrender. I'm not good enough for that. Of course you are. We all have heard you play and it's incredible, Izuku said, dropping the mask of void to show his earnestness. Kyuka still looked unsure. I will think about it, she said, focusing on her lunch. The rest of the gang nodded at her consideration. They weren't the type to push. What else could we do? Haunted house, Mina proposed. Oh, and the boss man could make the whole room pitch black, and they had to find their way blind, Hanta said with interest in the idea. Adding it to the list. Toru nodded and picked at Izuku's tray of food. Izuku is used to her trying and steal his food away. He thinks it stems from her quirk and usually never being able to be seen. He makes a small dome of shield energy to ward her off. She pinched his side and he relented easily. Instead of trying to take his food, she tried to feed him. With a blush at the eyes of his friends watching with amusement, he took the bite. The end of lunch came and everyone went back to class to finish off the day. Hero studies just started and everyone grabbed their cases to suit up, but Aizawa raised his hand before they could leave. Izuku let out a long sigh when Eraserhead's eyes landed on him. Nezu wanted to talk about whatever. Aizawa motioned in the general direction of his office. Izuku didn't say anything and took his case with him to talk to the Chimera. He gave reassuring nods to his friends and walked out of the classroom. He didn't bother imagining what the principal wanted to speak about. As a hero, Principal Nezu is one of the greatest simply because of his mind, but his motives have always been hidden away lest someone try to thwart them. He is the type of person who takes care of his own first, including himself. That isn't a selfish ideal but a reasonable one, and Izuku could support it. However, his view of the hero was skewed when he accepted Bakugo into the hero program. Now that the idea of him being in the same classroom as Izuku again has settled in, he can think more rationally. He could see a few reasons why Nezu accepted Bakugo into his school even after all the hassle that surely came from that. The first reason was that whoever worked for the lawyers of Bakugo was powerful enough to grant whatever Nezu wanted, and the appeal was too great to allow it to pass. Izuku could think up a few groups that had that kind of power, and none of them were good. The next reason would have to be that Nezu didn't want Bakugo released into the streets after his time in jail and become a villain. It would be reasonable to think he would become one since many villain stories are much too similar to Bakugo's. Nezu didn't want a villain who was a walking nitroglycerin factory with anger issues roaming Japan. The last reason Izuku could think up was that Nezu had a soft heart, but Izuku didn't think so. Maybe Nezu was the type to give out second chances, but Bakugo had more than enough chances to be better. It didn't matter if Bakugo took one step out of line, he would take care of it personally. He had the power to do so now. Arriving at the door to the principal's office, he knocked and the door swung open without him having to touch it. "Welcome. I'm so glad to have you join me. Come in." Nezu greeted happily while beginning to pour tea. Izuku walked in after sensing the rest of the room. No one else was inside but Nezu. Eraserhead said you wanted to speak. Nothing so official. Just a chat between like-minded individuals is all. Nezu pushed the tray of tea and treats to the couches and jumped up onto one. Izuku went along with whatever Nezu had planned and set his suitcase down next to the couch. He took one cup of tea and took a sip while waiting for Nezu to begin. He had to admit the tea Nezu served was great. "What do you think of One for All?" Nezu began. Izuku raised his eyebrow at the blunt question. "Many things. What in particular are you asking?" He had thought about the idea of a quirk that could be passed on like a relay racer. "I don't have much information about the quirk itself, so I am limited." All he knew was it could be transferred, and it was a strength enhancement with a quirk boost to boot. Nezu nodded and took a bite of biscuit as he thought for a moment. "Yes, some more information would be good," Nezu said slowly, and began to tell Izuku about the story of two brothers in the dawn of quirks. Izuku listened attentively to the story and was fascinated by the idea of such a quirk being handed around to defeat such an evil until it became strong enough to beat the source where the quirk was created. Izuku was quiet for a moment after Nezu finished the story. He had a few things to process, most importantly, why would Nezu tell him this? Why? Izuku asked plainly. Nezu didn't need any more words to know what Izuku was asking. Because Mirio is dying from old age at an accelerated rate and you already know about the quirk. What's a bit more information at this point? Izuku recalled the blonde hair turning gray at the roots. Mirio is dying, he repeated. While he didn't care for the upperclassmen, it was saddening to hear such a bright young man being snuffed out at a young age. From old age. Izuku furrowed his brows at the key point. Yes. Recovery Girl looked over him, and his cells were degenerating at an impossible speed to help him, Nezu explained. Izuku was quiet for a long moment as he thought about the issue. It's a stockpile quirk, like Ares, but what does it stockpile? Nezu shook his head and raised his paws in a sign of, I don't know, before lowering them. At first I thought it was life force. The quirk slowly began to draw out life force from the user in its infancy, and now that it's grown stronger. The quirk would have drawn more, but if that was the case, then using the quirk would slow the effect. Izuku finished. Exactly. Recovery Girl did just so. Mirio kept the quirk active as she tested some of his cells, and they continued to degenerate on his body. Nezu finished. Izuku hummed in thought and absent-mindedly took another sip of tea. Okay. The quirk stockpiles energy. From what? Izuku shook his head and moved past it. That's for later. Why is the quirk killing Mirio? When did he take the quirk? Nezu answered immediately. Just before the school year began. Almost a year. Izuku filed that for later. How many users have there been before, and for how long have they had it each? Mirio is the 9th. As for how long each user held the quirk, it's hard to tell. Ms. Maverick didn't share too many details other than the base information before handing over One for All. We know Yagi Tashinori held it for over 40 years. Izuku pinched his lip and racked his mind. He furrowed his brow and asked, You ever heard of the quirk singularity theory? Nezu's eyes gleamed as he sat forward. I have. What a marvelous paper. Izuku nodded eagerly along with Nezu but stopped himself from going on a tangent. One for all has been passed along for so long and it's been growing for 200 years. What if it hits Quirk singularity and it becomes too much for a person to handle? Why Mirio's cells are degenerating at an accelerated rate. Nezu also calmed himself for beginning to talk about theory and focused on the issue. It might explain why Mirio broke his arm when he first used it. It's become too much. Izuku raised an eyebrow at that and remembered seeing Mirio's broken arms during the raid. Using it could break his body? If he uses it at 100%, yes. He's been slowly building up to that, but he is at 10% output, otherwise he strains his body and breaks something. Nezu explained. You believe that all for one has reached Quirk singularity? That's what I think, yes. More now than before, with Mirio hurting himself just to use it to its best. Maybe someone with the right Quirk synergy to take the abuse of one for all, but it wouldn't stop the degenerating of cells. He sighed. One for all has become so powerful that it's breaking the user's body apart, Izuku stated. Nezu nodded. It appears it has. The two were silent for a long moment before Izuku furrowed his brows and looked at Nezu sharply. Where is Eri? Nezu was brought out of his thoughts. Oh, she is taking a nap in my room. Nezu hopped off the sofa and scurried to the bookshelf. It opened a secret room with Eri in bed with the covers over her. She woke and looked bleary-eyed at the two. She recognized the two and jumped out of bed to hug Izuku before jumping onto the couch and falling back asleep using his lap as a pillow. Izuku smiled softly down at her and brushed her hair as she snored softly. Nezu leapt back onto his couch and took his teacup. The two continued their conversation about one for all reaching Quirk singularity quietly as Eri snoozed on Izuku's lap. Chapter 42. Building for the festival. Izuku carried Eri back to the dorms on his back. She was still drowsy from her nap earlier, and he took pity upon her and gave her a piggyback ride. She buried her face into the back of his shirt as he emanated low heat to make her feel more comfortable. Izuku's mind was back on the topic of one for all and how it could be killing Mirio. He could understand if he used it improperly, which caused his health to decline, such as breaking bones constantly while using the Quirk, but if the Quirk is just killing him while he holds, then there must be something they weren't seeing. His immediate solution was to hand it off to someone they could trust, and if they showed the same effects, then they had more information. Maybe it requires a person with a compatible Quirk or body to keep all for one. Then he thought about Yagi Tashinori while he held the Quirk. He was Quirkless and he held it for over 40 years and he showed no symptoms that Mirio had. From what Nezu said, it was a stockpile Quirk which, from what Izuku could guess, had a lot of energy built up. He almost salivated at the idea of gaining that kind of energy and experimenting with it with the others he had in his core. Maybe even enhance them like it did to Mirio's Quirk. He shook his head to focus on the subject he was thinking about. The motion caused Eri to let out a large yawn, and Izuku looked over his shoulder to see her rubbing her eyes. He smiled warmly at her and continued his trek to the dorms where the rest of his friends waited. With some difficulty, he got the doors open and walked into the common room to hear his classmates discussing what they should do for the school festival. He walked to an open spot on one of the couches and squatted down for Eri to sit on. He felt her shuffle off his back and onto the couch. He turned to pat her head gently with a smile. "Good nap?" he asked. She let out another yawn while nodding. "You're warm," she mumbled. He chuckled softly. "I figured you'd like that." "You hungry?" he asked as he stood up. She shook her head and pulled her backpack around to open it. "I have homework," she said, opening it. "You need help?" He sat beside her on the couch to see what Nezu had given her. "I got it." "All right, let me know if you need anything." He patted her head again and stood up to join the rest of his class to see what they decided on for the festival. He walked closer just in time to hear Denki say, "And with Izuku's help it will be pitch black." Mina beside him nodded emphatically. "With my help," Izuku said with a raised eyebrow. Everyone turned to him. Denki and Mina immediately bolted up to him and grabbed each hand with gleaming eyes. "Yes," they said in unison. "No, it's still not decided." Kyuka jabbed an earlobe into Denki's arm to let a surprised Izuku go. Turu's invisible hand slapped Mina's hand away and hooked her arm with his. "Mine, haunted house isn't a bad idea." Yairuzo piped in while tapping a pen on her chin in thought. "I like it," Tsuyu said next to Uraraka. My class did them when I was in middle school and it was enjoyable. Izuku just listened as they argued about what to do for the festival. He felt comfortable with Toru's arm around his arm and thought about his past experiences with school festivals. To say the least, it was never fun. So instead of thinking about his past school, he focused on his present class, arguing against Sato setting up a pastry stand since it would set on his shoulders too much. They liked the idea of a petting zoo that could have brought up, but the logistics of a variety of animals would be a mess. By the end of the discussion, they were split between three options: a haunted house and a concert. After finding out that some people could play some instruments, the idea of a concert was more feasible, but that would hinge on whether or not they wanted to play for the public. What would you like, zoo? Toru asked on his arm. He shrugged. I don't know. They both seem alright, I guess. Never been to either, so I wouldn't know really. He rubbed his shoulder subconsciously. What about you? He asked her in return. The idea of a haunted house would be pretty fun, and I'm not sure if Kyo would be comfortable with playing in front of everyone. Like you said before, it's supposed to be fun, not nerve-wracking, she said, beaming up at him. Izuku returned the smile as they put the two ideas to a vote. As Yaoruzo was prepared to get everyone's votes, he saw Kyuka shifting nervously. He emitted a low rhythm of sound energy to get her attention. She perked at the sound of a simple tune and turned to him in question. He returned the questioning look and nodded to the vote. She understood what he was asking and hesitated before shaking her head subtly. All right, who wants the haunted house? Yaoruzo asked the class. Haunted house seems more simple to do, Izuku said casually and raised his hand. Yes. Mina cheered and followed Izuku's lead. The rest of the gang of friends went along with their leader without much thought. Kyuka let out a quiet sigh of relief when she counted more than half the class's vote for the haunted house. She smiled grateful towards Izuku and he nodded with an understanding smile. He sure wouldn't want to be the center of attention, as she surely would have if they chose to do a concert. Before Yaoruzo could say anything else, Mina leapt onto her feet with a cheer. Yes, haunted house. What's the theme? Should it all be pitch black? Or just one section? What movie or show should we go off by? She asked excitedly in rapid fire. Easy there. Denki raised his hands in a placating manner. I think she should lead this project, no? He turned to the class president in question. She shrugged and stepped back. That's acceptable. Mina squealed, barely containing the excitement, and then ran off to the stairs, shouting over her shoulder as she went. I'll be right back. Not too long after, Mina's footsteps were heard over the balcony of the second floor of the dorms. Izuku looked up just in time to see Mina leap over the railing, smiling all the while, and aimed her landing on him. Mina! He shouted in concern for his friend's safety. He simultaneously pulled the gravity in her direction to slow the fall, and then as soon as she was in arm's reach, he touched her leg to absorb the kinetic moments. He glared at her as she floated over them. I knew you'd catch me, she said smugly. Gravity returned and she fell the remaining 2 feet. Ow! My bones! She groaned and held her but where she landed on. She let go of the few things she brought from her room and fell to the ground with her. Tokoyami picked up one book that he had in his room. H.P. Lovecraft? He asked in surprise at the book he held. Yes, that's original horror right there. With his help, she gestured to Izuku. We have advanced darkness, she said eagerly. Some of the class snorted at the reference but continued with the rest of the things she brought. I thought we were doing a haunted house, not a house of horrors? Tsuyu asked.
Potato, tomato.
Mina waved off the words. It's a place we set up to scare people, whether that be ghosts or eldritch abominations? She shrugged. Of course, ghosts do have that nice appeal. I rather like the idea of this. Tokoyami tapped the book he held. That's why I brought all this. This is most of my collection of horror, so we can get some ideas of what we can do. Mina spread out the DVDs, books, and magazines. We have paranormal horror, body horror, psychological horror, Lovecraftian horror, and slasher horror. The list goes on, but I thought this should be enough. That's a lot, Yaoruzo said with raised eyebrows. She picked up one book of Japanese horror stories. She opened it and skimmed through the contents. The class looked over the contents. Some of the weaker-willed were unsettled right away from the few words or images they saw, but most of the class began to get excited at the prospect of building a haunted house. The ones who didn't like horror, like Kuda and Aoyama, stepped back from the contents in favor of promising to help in other ways in the future. The class was happy to let them retreat from the multiple disturbing images of the collection that Mina brought. "You ever like any of this?" Toru asked Izuku and motioned to the novel she was reading the back of. "Never really cared for horror. I was more factual books than fiction," Izuku said, picking up one old movie of a man with a chainsaw. "Some are based on true stories," Mina said excitedly. "Like that one?" "Well, mostly." She pointed at the movie Izuku held. Some parts were taken from real events and others were exaggerated. After the class debated what kind of haunted house they were going for, they landed on a Japanese folklore horror. It was basic, but with Mina's enthusiasm, they were sure it would turn out better. The next day, the class told Aizawa their decision, and they were provided a larger room and material for construction. The first thing was to build the layout of the path the victims would walk. They were given the week to work on the room, with the rest of the school in a similar situation as they were working on their projects. The class decided on a simple winding path that had many small sections where the victims would encounter one of them dressed up. They planned to have Kuda have a few crows around the room to make noise to spook the people who walked in. Dark Shadow would be moving around the room and popping in randomly. His glowing yellow eyes would be perfect to keep people looking out of the mischievous Quirk. Yairuzo was helping with making the costumes for the people who would be participating. Uraraka and Tsuyu were the first two to volunteer to be dressed up and scare people. Toru was, of course, told to get her hero costume and mess with people as they went through the room like Dark Shadow would. As part of the class planned out who would do what and where, the rest got started on building the path the people would walk through. It was simple to build wooden archways for the path and draping cloth for the walls of the tunnel. They planned to have the path stretch the whole room until the very end, where there will be an open section with Izuku making it darker than dark before the exit. But first, they were building the path. Izuku put together the wooden arch before looking for the hammer he had just set down. He frowned and looked around to see Denki had taken it and was building another one. He shrugged and turned to his arch. Instead of waiting as anyone else would, he experimentally placed his finger on the nail that was supposed to hold the wood together and applied some kinetic energy. Apparently, it was too much, since instead of the nail being driven into the wood, it shot through the wood entirely and penetrated the concrete floor. He frantically waved the concrete dust away and checked on the wooden arch. The wood was fine, with an added nail-sized hole. Izuku was startled by Denki poking him with the borrowed hammer. "You good?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. "Fine," he squeaked out and subtly hid the hole in the ground and the wood. He cleared his throat and asked for another nail. I lost the other one," he lied. Denki stared at his friend in suspicion, but passed him another nail from the box beside him. "Sure," he said with squinted eyes. The absorber properly drove the nail into the wooden support and set the arch to the side with the others. He continued to build the path with the others, but his eyes couldn't stop from drifting off to where the nail shot through the ground, with just a bit of guilt at the accident. Bit by bit, the room was built, with each day getting closer to the day of the festival. And that's a wrap for part 6 of What If Deku Had Energy Absorption Quirk. A huge thanks to Big Teddy G3498. This story just keeps getting better. And to all my legends, I seriously couldn't do this without you. Make sure to drop a like, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. More epic content is coming your way, so stay tuned, and I'll catch you in the next one.